Every night in bedrooms across the world, something unfolds between two people that feels natural, beautiful, even sacred. And yet, what if I told you that this very act, this most intimate expression of love, could be silently shaping your spiritual energy in ways you've never considered? That the peace you've been searching for, the emotional clarity you long for, might be slipping through your fingers because of something you thought was harmless. In Buddhist teachings, it is said that every action, especially those tied to desire, carries a karmic weight. It doesn't matter how quiet the moment feels. If it's done without awareness, without alignment, it leaves a trace on your soul. The Buddha reminded us that craving is the root of suffering, and desire without mindfulness often leads us into patterns that feel good temporarily, but drain us deeply over time. We don't talk about this enough. We talk about love, we talk about pleasure, but rarely do we ask if our intimacy is actually in harmony with our inner path, if it's nurturing the temple of the body or quietly desecrating it. This isn't about guilt or shame, it's about truth, gentle truth that awakens, not wounds. And if you stay with me through this video, if you resist the urge to skip or scroll, you might hear something that speaks directly to the part of you that's been quietly aching for spiritual alignment. And if what we're doing here resonates with you, if these conversations feel needed in a world that moves too fast, that numbs too easily, then here's a simple free favor I'll ask from the heart. Hit that subscribe button. It's one way to let this space grow so that more people who are lost in noise can come back to what's real, what's sacred, what matters. Let's go deeper. There's something most people miss when they talk about intimacy. We're taught to focus on the physical, on chemistry, attraction, and desire. But what if that's only the surface? What if beneath every touch, every embrace, every moment of connection between two people, there's something much deeper happening, something that carries energy, karma, and spiritual consequence? In Buddhism, we don't separate the body from the mind, or the heart from the spirit. Everything is interwoven. Every act, especially one as vulnerable and personal as intimacy, has layers that affect not just your mood or your relationship, but your entire path to awakening. The Buddha often spoke about mindfulness as the foundation of all right action. He didn't say avoid this or don't do that out of moral rigidity. He simply taught, be aware. When we act without awareness, we suffer. And nowhere is this more true than in how we approach intimacy. When two people unite physically, it's not just bodies coming together, it's energies blending, intentions merging, karmic threads intertwining. And yet so many people go into these sacred moments on autopilot, driven by desire, distraction, or even fear of loneliness, without pausing to consider the spiritual. Think about it. How many times have you or someone you know walked away from an intimate encounter feeling drained, emotionally heavy, or just off? It's not always about the relationship itself. Sometimes it's because the act wasn't aligned with your deeper truth. In Buddhist philosophy, this disconnection is a sign that something unconscious was at play. The intention behind the act may have come from craving rather than compassion, from ego rather than presence. The act itself might have looked loving, but inside, it lacked the stillness that makes love truly healing. There's a powerful teaching in Buddhism that says whatever is done with greed, hatred, or delusion leads to suffering. It's not about the act, it's about the state of mind behind it. So when we talk about intimacy, we have to ask, are we coming from clarity or confusion? Are we using each other to escape our inner voids? Or are we meeting in mutual awareness? When intimacy is grounded in mindfulness, it becomes a form of meditation, a way to be fully present, a moment where the ego dissolves and connection deepens, not just with another person, but with the present moment, with the breath, with the sacredness of life itself. Tantric Buddhism, especially in its more esoteric forms, holds that sexual energy is not dirty or sinful. It's potent and divine, but it must be treated like fire. When honored and guided, it can bring light, warmth, and transformation. When misused or left unchecked, it burns and destroys. This is why Tantra is not about technique, but about consciousness. It teaches that intimacy should be slow, intentional, and filled with reverence, not performance. Every movement becomes a prayer, every breath becomes a bridge to something beyond the physical. There's this quiet emptiness that creeps in after the moment is over. Two people lie next to each other, close in body but strangely distant in spirit. And they don't talk about it, not because they're hiding anything, but because they don't even know what they're feeling. It's like something's missing, but they can't put it into words. In today's world, we've been taught that as long as there's consent and affection, intimacy is healthy and good. But the Buddha taught us to go beyond surface appearances. He reminded us to ask, what is the state of the mind behind the act? What is the quality of the awareness we bring into it? Modern culture has separated the act from the intention. We chase pleasure because we believe it will make us feel whole. But too often, it just leaves us wanting more. We keep going back to the same experiences, hoping this time it will feel different. And when it doesn't, we quietly wonder if something is wrong with us, or worse, with the person we love. But what if nothing is broken, just misaligned? What if it's not about the act at all, but about the energy we bring into it? In Buddhism, mindfulness is everything. It is the gateway to liberation. If you bring unconscious craving into something as intimate as sex, you're not healing, you're repeating. You're feeding samsara, the endless cycle of dissatisfaction. But here's the problem: our world tells us to numb the discomfort, not observe it. So we scroll, we distract, we chase dopamine, and we perform closeness instead of cultivating it. We think intensity equals connection, but the Buddha would gently ask, does your intimacy bring peace to the mind, or does it create more mental noise? This disconnection is subtle, that's what makes it dangerous. It doesn't scream at you, it whispers. It hides behind pleasure, it hides behind routine. But if you're quiet enough, if you slow down and really listen, you'll feel it. That lack of presence, that post-act heaviness, that quiet craving for something more sacred. And once you see it, you can't unsee it. That's where real transformation begins, not with shame, but with seeing clearly. The Buddha didn't tell us to avoid intimacy. He told us to meet it with awareness, to know what we're doing, why we're doing it, and what fruit it's bearing in our lives. That's how we begin to reconnect with ourselves, with our partners, and with the deeper peace we're all truly longing for. There's something most people never learn about desire. It's not just about what you feel in the body, it's about what you stir in the mind. In Buddhist thought, desire is like fire. When controlled and used wisely, it can bring warmth, light, and even transformation. But when left unchecked, it burns through clarity, distorts perception, and leaves ashes where peace once lived. Sexual energy especially is one of the most misunderstood forces we carry. It isn't dirty or shameful, but it's incredibly powerful. And when we use it without mindfulness, without awareness of its impact, we begin to misuse it in ways that quietly erode our spiritual strength. The Buddha never said that intimacy itself is wrong. What he warned us about is attachment to pleasure, getting lost in it, chasing it, needing it to feel whole. That's where the trouble begins. Because the more we use physical acts to escape our emotions, to fill a void, or to feel wanted, the more we train our minds to depend on something outside of ourselves for peace. That craving becomes a habit, and that habit becomes suffering. This is why in many Buddhist traditions, practitioners are taught to observe their desires instead of obeying them. Not to repress them, but to understand them, to see clearly whether our actions are rooted in love and presence, or in restlessness and fear. Sometimes people believe that because they're in a relationship or a marriage, any physical connection is automatically good and healthy. But even in committed partnerships, energy can be misused. When intimacy is used to cover up conflict, avoid difficult emotions or manipulate affection, it becomes an act of ego, not love. It reinforces delusion instead of truth. And the result? A subtle sense of disconnection. You may not know why you feel emotionally distant or spiritually heavy, but deep down, the misuse of energy is silently doing its work. Buddhism teaches that everything we do with the body should support the path to awakening. That includes how we speak, how we move, how we touch. When intimacy becomes unconscious, it stops being a sacred act and starts becoming a karmic loop. You're not just connecting with someone, you're binding energies, shaping mental formations, and planting seeds that will eventually ripen. So the question isn't just, did it feel good? It's, was it mindful? Was it wholesome? Did it bring me closer to inner peace or further away? That's where true awareness begins. And once you begin to see that clearly, you can start using this powerful energy as a tool for healing instead of harm. We grow up believing that freedom means doing whatever we want, whenever we want, that if something feels good and no one gets hurt, it must be okay. Culture repeats this like a mantra. Follow your heart, trust your desires, you deserve to feel good. But here's something the Buddha warned us about long ago. Desire, especially sensual desire, can be the most deceptive form of bondage. It doesn't come with chains or bars. It comes disguised as pleasure, dressed in the illusion of liberation. But the more we chase it without awareness, the more we find ourselves trapped in cycles we don't even realize we're repeating. The Buddha taught that true freedom isn't about obeying every impulse. It's about understanding where that impulse comes from and whether it leads to peace or suffering. He called craving the root of dukkha, which means suffering, dissatisfaction, unease. When we blindly follow every pull of the body or every whisper of desire, we think we're exercising our will. But more often than not, we're just feeding a fire that never says, enough. And that fire, if left unchecked, burns through our clarity, our energy, even our relationships. Think about it. How many times have we done something we wanted in the moment, only to feel heavy or confused later? We call it freedom, but we're not any lighter. We call it choice, but we feel stuck. That's because real freedom doesn't come from indulging every urge. It comes from pausing, from asking, is this aligned with the peace I say I want? The Buddha encouraged us to examine our lives not with harshness, but with awareness, to watch the mind, to see how it reacts and to learn from it, not obey it blindly. In Buddhist practice, restraint is not suppression, it's wisdom. It's knowing when a yes is rooted in truth and when a no is an act of self-respect. It's knowing that your body is sacred and your energy isn't something to throw into every passing moment of desire. When you start choosing from that place, not fear, not craving, but clarity, you begin to taste what true freedom actually feels like. Not wild, not chaotic, but still, grounded, peaceful. The kind of freedom that doesn't come and go with mood or lust, but one that stays because it's rooted in presence. And that, my friend, is a kind of freedom worth cultivating. There's something quiet that happens inside us when we're close to someone, not just physically, but emotionally, energetically. And yet so often, even in the most intimate moments, something still feels missing. You care about the person, you might even love them deeply. But after everything is said and done, there's a lingering emptiness, like your spirit and your body are telling two different stories. Buddhism speaks clearly to this. When desire becomes unconscious, it becomes a distraction from awakening. The Buddha didn't condemn love or even sensuality. What he warned against was attachment without awareness, pleasure without purpose, desire without discipline. We're told by the world that as long as it's mutual and feels good, it's healthy. But feeling good in the moment is not the same as feeling peaceful after. That's where the mind and heart often collide. Physical union can feel comforting, even euphoric, but if it's built on unresolved wounds, fear of loneliness, or a desire to escape your inner discomfort, then what seems like a sacred connection may quietly be pulling you away from your path. In Buddhist practice, we're encouraged to examine not just what we do, but why we do it. The intention behind every action becomes the root of its karmic fruit. And when it comes to intimacy, this couldn't be more important. There's a middle path, as the Buddha taught, not rejection of connection and not indulgence in craving, but conscious union. Being fully present with your partner, not just in body but in mind and spirit. Asking, am I here to give or just to take? Am I trying to love or trying to avoid something inside myself? When intimacy becomes mechanical, something to check off a list or a habit to fill a void, it loses its sacredness. It becomes noise. But when done with awareness, with breath, with silence between movements, even the simplest touch becomes a form of meditation. You know that feeling when something seems right on the surface, but deep down something just feels off? Maybe you can't explain it, maybe it doesn't make logical sense, but your body knows, your energy knows. After a night of what seemed like closeness or passion, you wake up feeling drained, restless, or strangely heavy, and you think, why? Nothing went wrong, but not everything that feels good is nourishing. In Buddhist teachings, this awareness, the ability to observe the subtle consequences of our actions, is essential to waking up from illusion. The Buddha taught that everything we do leaves a mark, not just on the outside world, but inside our hearts and minds. That's why even the most private actions like physical intimacy have the power to either elevate or unsettle our energy. We live in a culture that rarely pauses to ask what's happening beneath the surface. But Buddhism invites us to slow down and see clearly. Every intention we carry into a moment, every craving, attachment, insecurity, or unconscious emotion shapes the outcome of that moment. So if we step into intimacy with restlessness, ego, or emptiness, no matter how beautiful the moment looks from the outside, the energy it generates will reflect those roots. And here's the truth. Energy doesn't lie. You can pretend everything is fine, say all the right things, go through the motions of love. But if the energy is confused, the body will feel it. The mind will feel it. Your spirit will whisper that something isn't quite in harmony. That whisper, that's wisdom. In Buddhism, this is called sati, mindfulness, the sacred act of knowing what's really going on. It's not about judging yourself or others. It's about learning to feel honestly. When we ignore what our energy is telling us, we end up repeating cycles that leave us more confused, more tired, more disconnected. But when we begin to listen, to observe without denial, something beautiful happens. We start to choose differently. We begin to understand that intimacy isn't just physical, it's spiritual architecture, and it must be built with truth, not illusion. So the next time you feel that quiet unease after a moment of connection, don't brush it away. Bow to it. Because it's not guilt, it's not a weakness, it's insight. It's the Buddha within you saying, look deeper. Some people walk through life with a strange heaviness they can't quite explain. They meditate, they eat well, they try to think positively, but something lingers. A fog in the mind, a sense of spiritual fatigue, and often they don't realize that this weight isn't random. It's not just emotional or psychological. It might be the residue of moments that were meant to be sacred, but were lived unconsciously. In Buddhism, every act leaves an imprint, what we call karma. But not all karma is dramatic or visible. Sometimes it's quiet. Sometimes it settles into your spirit like dust you forgot to clean. The Buddha taught that sensual desire, when pursued without mindfulness, pulls us away from our center. Physical intimacy, in particular, is powerful energy. It can be a path to presence, or it can tie you down to patterns of attachment, confusion, and suffering. When we engage in intimacy without awareness, without care for the energy we're exchanging, we unknowingly create a kind of spiritual residue. It's like burning incense in a closed room. The smell lingers long after the flame goes out, and if you keep lighting incense without clearing the air, eventually you can't breathe deeply anymore. This residue is not about guilt, it's about energy. Every time you share your body, you're also sharing your energy. If the connection isn't clear, if it's rooted in craving, avoidance, or habit, that energy doesn't just disappear. It stays with you, it seeps into your nervous system, it clouds your intuition. And the more unaware we are, the more we carry without realizing it. This is why, in certain Buddhist monastic lineages, practitioners take vows of celibacy, not out of shame, but out of a deep understanding of energy. They recognize that intimacy is never just physical. It's a karmic exchange that shapes the heart and stains the mind. You don't have to be a monk to see the truth in this. Think about it. Have you ever felt emotionally off after being with someone, even someone you cared about? That isn't always about regret. Sometimes it's the aftershock of energy misalignment. The body might say yes, but the soul feels unsettled. That's spiritual residue, and the first step to clearing it isn't self-blame, it's awareness. With awareness comes purification. With purification comes freedom. That's the Buddhist path, not perfection, but clarity. And clarity begins when we stop pretending our most intimate moments are separate from our spiritual journey. They're not. They never were. You can light candles, wear silk robes, play soft music, and even speak all the right spiritual phrases. But if your mind is elsewhere, if your heart is disconnected, the energy will always reveal the truth. Sacredness isn't something you can manufacture with props. It's not about performance, it's about presence. The Buddha never asked for rituals to impress others. He spoke of mindfulness, awareness, and the purity of intention. That's where real sacredness lives. Not in how something looks from the outside, but in the vibration it carries from within. In the same way, intimacy, no matter how tender or beautiful it may appear, cannot be called sacred just because it's wrapped in a relationship or labeled with love. If it's done to fill a void, to escape loneliness, or to meet an unspoken expectation, then the body might feel something, but the spirit remains untouched. The Buddha taught that all things begin in the mind. So if the mind is clouded, the act becomes clouded too. It might satisfy the surface, but deep down you know it doesn't nourish your soul. We live in a world obsessed with appearance. We've been conditioned to chase connection through technique, to measure closeness through frequency, and to mimic what we see in movies and media. But no matter how much effort is made to make it special, if the act itself is unconscious, if it's driven by craving or fear or habit, it's just another moment of disconnection dressed up as love. You can't fake stillness, you can't fake reverence, and you definitely can't fake your presence. Sacred energy recognizes sacred intention. It knows when you've slowed down enough to truly be with someone, when your heart is open and your spirit is aligned. That's why Buddhism calls us back again and again to the breath, to the now. The moment you are fully here, not performing, not seeking, but just being, that's where sacredness begins. Whether it's holding hands or something far more intimate, the question is never what you're doing, but why and how. Are you awake in the moment, or are you just repeating a pattern? When love becomes conscious, it becomes transformative. That is the kind of connection that not only brings peace, it invites the divine, and that truly can't be faked. The way we enter moments of intimacy often reflects exactly how we live our lives. If you're rushing through your day, jumping from one thing to the next without much thought, chances are that same hurried energy shows up in the way you connect with others behind closed doors. If your mind is full of noise, judgments, and distractions, your body doesn't magically become sacred just because the lights are off. The Buddha taught that mindfulness is not something we turn on during meditation and then forget about. It's a way of being, a mirror that shows us who we are in every moment, especially in our most vulnerable ones. When two people come together in physical union, there is a deep truth revealed about their connection, their emotional honesty, and their energetic state. If you're present, tender, intentional, that presence becomes the foundation of the experience. But if you're disconnected, using the moment to escape stress, avoid emotions, or fill a void, that energy leaks into the space, whether you realize it or not. According to Buddhist wisdom, intention shapes outcome. So what is your intention when you enter these intimate spaces? Is it rooted in compassion, awareness, and love? Or is it driven by habit, pressure, or avoidance? The Buddha often reminded us that everything we do with the body shapes the mind, and everything we do with the mind shapes our future. In this way, the bedroom becomes more than a place of comfort. It becomes a mirror. It shows you whether you are awake or asleep in your life, whether your actions are aligned with wisdom or entangled in craving. And here's the beautiful thing. When you notice this without judgment, you can begin to transform it. The breath becomes a bridge, the touch becomes a teaching, the silence between words becomes a doorway to deep presence. We all carry a past. Sometimes it's loud and obvious, filled with stories we openly admit. Other times it's quiet, a weight we can't quite name, but feel deep in our chest when we're alone. And for many, that quiet weight has everything to do with intimacy. Maybe you gave your energy to someone who didn't respect it. Maybe you acted out of loneliness instead of love. Or maybe you've been caught in a cycle, repeating the same patterns, calling them connection, when deep down you knew something felt off. The Buddha taught that our lives are shaped by what we repeatedly do, not just our words, not just our hopes, but our habits. And that includes the way we approach physical and emotional closeness. The beautiful truth is that nothing in your past disqualifies you from inner peace. Nothing you've done has to define who you are becoming. In fact, Buddhism reminds us that awakening often begins at the very moment we see our patterns clearly, not with shame but with soft awareness. The moment you recognize that your actions haven't been aligned with your deepest values, that's the seed of transformation. Karma is not punishment, it's cause and effect. If the causes have brought you pain, you can plant new ones that bring you peace. That shift begins not in the body, but in the mind. Breaking the pattern doesn't require dramatic declarations or isolation from the world. It starts small. It starts the moment you pause before an act and ask, is this nourishing my soul or numbing something I don't want to feel? It starts when you stop pretending you don't notice the emptiness after something that was supposed to make you feel loved. The Buddha never said desire was wrong. He simply taught us to look at our desires with clarity. What are you chasing and why? And is the chase pulling you toward joy or further into confusion? There's a moment just before you act, before you say the words, before you reach out, before you take the step, where everything is still. In that quiet space lives the most powerful force in your spiritual life, intention. It's invisible, but it shapes everything that follows. In Buddhism, this is not just a concept, it is the very heart of karma. The Buddha taught that intention is what gives action its moral and spiritual weight. It's not the act alone that creates energy, but the why behind it. Two people can do the same thing, but the outcomes, karmically and emotionally, can be worlds apart, simply because their intentions were different. When it comes to intimacy, we often forget this. We get caught in habit, in impulse, in routine. We think as long as it's mutual, it must be okay. But the Buddha's teachings ask us to pause and look deeper. Why are you doing this? Is it to connect, to honor, to uplift both yourself and your partner? Or is it to escape, to silence a discomfort, to fill an emptiness? This isn't about blaming yourself, it's about waking up. Because the more unconscious your intentions, the more likely you are to feel confused afterward. That strange emotional hangover, that quiet feeling of distance or sadness, it often begins with intention. And here's the beautiful part. When your intention is rooted in mindfulness, even the most ordinary moments become sacred. A touch becomes healing. A breath becomes communion. A glance becomes a presence. That's what the Buddha meant when he said, "With our thoughts, we make the world." Your relationships, your energy, your peace begins in the mind. And it begins with the question, am I doing this with awareness or am I just going through the motions? There's something deeply personal about how we treat our bodies. Some of us rush through life, using our bodies like tools, pushing through exhaustion, numbing discomfort, chasing momentary pleasures, without ever pausing to ask what it really means to live inside this human form. But the Buddha taught something radically different. He didn't speak of the body as something to be exploited or ignored. He called it a vessel, a foundation for awakening. In the Dhammapada, it's written, "The body is a fragile jar, consciousness the king within." That means every time we engage with another person physically, especially through intimacy, we're doing so with something that was never meant to be taken lightly. We're bringing our entire karmic stream, our past, our intention, our awareness, into that moment. This doesn't mean we should become afraid of touch or closeness. Quite the opposite. It means we should return to them with reverence, with presence, with the humility of someone entering sacred ground. Because when you treat your body as a temple, you begin to experience yourself not as an object to be desired, but as a sacred space to be honored. That's the shift. That's freedom. And that's what the Buddha pointed to. Not denial, but awakening. Not repression, but respect. And it all begins with awareness. Sometimes the most powerful realizations don't come in moments of intensity, but in moments of stillness. Those quiet spaces when the mind settles and the truth we've been avoiding gently rises to the surface. You might have gone through months, even years, repeating patterns in your relationships, in your intimacy, in your private life, thinking everything was fine. But deep inside, something feels off. There's a kind of emotional heaviness, a restlessness in the spirit. And no matter how much love you give or receive, it doesn't seem to quiet the discomfort. That's not failure, that's not broken. That's the beginning of clarity. The Buddha taught that everything we do, every thought, every action, every intention leaves a trace. And when we live unconsciously, those traces pile up. That's what karma is. Not punishment, but residue. Unseen, unprocessed energy we carry in our minds, in our bodies, even in our relationships. And sometimes the intimacy we engage in isn't rooted in love or awareness. It's rooted in habit, fear of loneliness, or the need to feel something. When we continue down that path, we drift further from ourselves. Not because we're bad, but because we're not present. We've forgotten to pause. We've forgotten to reflect. And that clarity doesn't come all at once. It arrives slowly, like morning light seeping into a dark room. At first, it's uncomfortable. You may feel grief, regret, or guilt for the times you weren't aligned with your highest self. But in Buddhism, those feelings are not obstacles. They're part of awakening. They're invitations to return to your center, to step away from what drains you and walk toward what heals you. When you choose mindfulness over impulse, presence over performance, awareness over avoidance, that is how you return to clarity. Not perfectly, just honestly. And that's all the path ever asks of you. You don't need incense, candles, or hours of ritual to begin reclaiming sacredness in your intimacy. What you need is presence. That's where it all starts. In the teachings of the Buddha, it's said that a single breath taken with full awareness is more powerful than 1,000 unconscious prayers. And that truth applies here too. Before anything begins, Before a touch, a kiss, a word, you have a choice. A chance to shift from automatic to intentional, to invite stillness into a space that's often rushed. So instead of going through the motions, take a pause, just a pause. One breath, hand over heart, eyes gently closed. Let the noise settle. Let the moment be quiet. Ask yourself, what is my intention here? Not just what your body wants, but what your soul needs. Are you reaching out because you want connection, healing, unity? Or are you trying to escape, to numb, to fill a void that doesn't go away no matter how many times you try? The Buddha often spoke of desire not as an enemy, but as something that needs understanding. When we act from blind craving, we strengthen the illusion of self. But when we act from clarity, from love anchored in awareness, even the most physical experiences can become spiritual offerings. This is not about stopping your desires. It's about sanctifying them, turning them into something beautiful, mindful, and transformative. You can begin by simply sitting with your partner. No pressure, no agenda. Look into each other's eyes, breathe together, maybe even speak aloud an intention for your union. May this moment bring peace, not tension. May it deepen trust, not fear. May it align us with compassion. You don't need to sound poetic or perfect. What matters is sincerity. There's something incredibly powerful about stopping, just for a moment, and really listening to the part of you that's quietly been asking for more. Not more stimulation, not more pleasure, but more meaning, more peace. In a world that glorifies indulgence and calls it freedom, it's easy to forget that true freedom, as the Buddha taught, comes not from doing whatever you want, but from mastering the desires that control you. And that mastery begins with awareness, the kind of awareness that says maybe there's something deeper going on here. Maybe I've been so focused on connection that I haven't asked if my connections are actually nourishing me or silently depleting me. If something in this message stirred something inside you, whether it was a quiet truth you didn't want to face or a memory that suddenly made sense, don't push it away. Sit with it. That stirring is not discomfort, it's awakening, and awakening doesn't always arrive as lightning or thunder. Sometimes it comes in the soft realization that you've been sleepwalking through something sacred. The Buddha never demanded blind belief. He asked only that we observe, look closely, ask, is this leading me to suffering or to peace? That's all. No punishment, no fear, just clarity. And if clarity is what you're seeking, then this moment is not random. It's an invitation, not from me, but from your own soul, to pause, to reflect, to ask yourself if the way you've been moving through intimacy, through relationships, through your most vulnerable spaces, truly reflects the sacredness you want to embody. It's okay if the answer is no. What matters is that you're asking the question now. Before you go, remember this. Your body is not just a vessel for desire, it's a temple of awareness. Every touch, every moment of intimacy can either deepen your peace or disturb your spirit. The Buddha taught that liberation begins with seeing clearly, so let this clarity guide you, not with fear, but with reverence. If something in your heart feels different now, honor it. Thank you for being part of this sacred conversation, for walking this mindful path with us. You are not alone on this journey. Stay open, stay grounded, and stay sacred. Now, if you're ready to go even deeper, watch one of the suggested videos on your screen. It may be the reflection your soul needs next. And thank you truly for being a part of Buddhist journey.